and greetings to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are very pleased to be launching the first Public International Law Distinguished Speaker Series with our guest today, Sue Biniaz. Sue Biniaz has served for over 30 years in the State Department's Legal Advisor's Office, where she was a deputy legal advisor, as well as a lead climate lawyer and a lead climate negotiator from 1989 until 2017. After leaving the US government, she was senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation and has taught at Columbia, Yale, and the University of Chicago. She recently returned to the State Department to support Special Presidential Envoy on Climate Change, John Kerry, on international climate negotiations, and she is also a senior fellow and lecturer at the Yale-Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. I first met Sue Biniaz when she was the lead climate lawyer for the US State Department and directly advising former President Obama and President Obama's chief climate negotiator, Todd Stern. Sue Biniaz was very influential throughout the climate change negotiations, and especially bringing the Paris Agreement to a successful conclusion. From personal knowledge, it was not simply because she represented a very powerful state, but also very much because of her style of negotiation. She did this by listening to and engaging with the different delegations to understand their concerns and finding compromise. Sue Biniaz, after hiatus during the Trump administration, is now back working with the Biden administration, and this can only be good news for advancing the climate agenda, especially under the Paris Agreement. I have a lot more I could say about Sue, but we should save our time to hear directly from her. The format today will be a conversation where Patricia and I will ask Sue questions. So Sue, welcome. It's great to have you here. And I'm going to start off with the first question. So amazingly, it's been over 5 years now since the Paris Agreement was concluded. But what were some of the more challenging aspects of negotiating the Paris Agreement?
Thank you, Nilofer, and thanks for inviting me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's very nice to see you again. And one of my happiest memories from the negotiations of the Paris Agreement was our bilateral meeting in Istanbul, talking through all the legal issues. So thanks again for that. So let me start with some of the global challenges we faced, and then maybe name a couple of the US specific challenges that we faced as a kind of national delegation. So I'll name about 5 of them. First, there was the issue of the legal nature of the commitments under the agreement. The mandate for the negotiation said that the agreement had to have some kind of legal force, quote unquote. So we knew from the outset it couldn't be like the Copenhagen Accord / Cancun agreements, which were thoroughly non-binding. But it was a totally open question which provisions should be legally binding, and you had a wide range of views. Some parties were very wedded to the Kyoto Protocol approach of, binding, 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 and others were very opposed to that approach, particularly if those binding commitments were going to apply to them. So that was, I would say, one huge issue on our plate. The second was the issue that we call differentiation for those who work in this field. There, the mandate, the Durban platform, well, it had language in it that to lawyers seems very odd or sort of tautological. It said the new instrument would be applicable to all parties, which is of course a truism, right? What agreement isn't applicable to all parties? If you're a party, it's applicable to you. But it was more of a political statement that, unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which was only applicable to some parties, the developed countries, this was more of a political signal that this was not going to be like the Kyoto Protocol. Everybody was going to have to do something under it. But how it was going to reflect commitments applicable to all parties was a completely, again, open question. Some parties were very wedded to kind of maintaining a Kyoto-like thick wall between developed and developing countries. And an even more extreme view was not just that the categories would be developed and developing, but that they would be the categories established in 1992. So in essence, about 30 years before this new instrument would kick in, the so-called Annex 1, non-Annex 1 categories, right? So that was an extreme view at one end of the spectrum, and others were very much against such a division of the world, but they expressed it in different ways. Some said there should be 2 categories, but that category from 1992 should be significantly expanded to include countries that were now emitting much more or were much more developed than they were in 1992. Some said, well, we don't really need 2 categories, we should have 3 categories, and the third should be these newly emerging developing countries with either resources to take action or with lots of emissions contributing to climate change. And some, like the US, said there shouldn't be any categories, we should just sidestep categories completely because it will be impossible to agree on them. So there was very much no agreement on that topic kind of on the way to Paris. Third, there was the issue of ambition. So it struck us and many others that even if you dealt somehow with the legal issue of binding versus non-binding, and if you dealt with the issue of differentiation and who should be responsible for doing what, you still needed to have an agreement that answered the mail with respect to the proper level of ambition, or you would not have achieved your environmental purpose. And that had several components to it. What should the global temperature goal of the agreement be? To date, the parties had agreed on, to start with, they had agreed not on a quantitative indicator, but just we need to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. They had moved on, through various instruments to say we should limit temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius and then below 2 degrees Celsius. So then there was an issue of like, should we go beyond that to well below 2, 1.5, so that you had this temperature goal issue, and then you had kind of an issue of like length or duration of agreement. Some parties, and I particularly recall China taking this position, said the agreement should just end in 2030. We should all put in one set of emission commitments, and then it's over, and then we can figure out what we're going to do next. And other parties, probably the preponderant view would have been, no, it should be a long-term agreement. We should set a global temperature goal and then periodically update what we are committing to do until we achieve the goal. So that was another issue related to ambition. A fourth issue was the process issue. The UNFCCC process had been, because of the inability of the parties to reach agreement on what their decision-making rule should be, the default rule had basically been thought of as a consensus rule, right? So nobody could formally object under a consensus process. In Cancun, that was tested a bit because you did have a country, in our view, that blocked consensus. So I think whether you call it consensus or something extremely close to consensus as the decision-making rule under the UNFCCC, you still have to construct an agreement that basically did not trigger objections from 1 or 2 or 3 parties, the way the Copenhagen Accord did. And then finally, there was a sense after Copenhagen that you wouldn't really get another chance at reaching agreement. And so there was this mantra that you heard from a lot of people saying that Paris was too big to fail. It would be a test of multilateralism way beyond climate. And if the world could not get together and reach agreement on dealing with what was perceived as a huge challenge, top priority issue, what hope would there be for multilateralism? So there was a lot of pressure on Paris from forces way beyond our narrower climate issue. All right, just 1 minute on a couple of the US specific challenges, and I'll just name 3 of them. We couldn't afford really to bring home another Kyoto Protocol style agreement. We didn't think that would be good for the US, of course, because we didn't want to be like a non-party once again to something that we had helped construct. And we didn't think it would be good for the world either, of course, given the US level of emissions and resources, et cetera. The second was we did not have an economy-wide target enshrined in US law. So we were pretty constrained in terms of the legal nature of targets going into this negotiation. And third, because we had an administration that had sort of staked itself out as pro-climate action, you know, and we had the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and also President Obama very out there in terms of supporting action and the Paris Agreement. I would say we were a little bit worried that other countries might think we would not be in a position to walk away. And if other countries think you're not going to walk away, then you have less leverage in terms of negotiating the terms of the agreement. So I've gone on way too long, but that'll give you a sense of at least my perceptions. Thanks.
No, not at all, Sue. I think you gave a great encapsulation of those key challenges, and these were certainly, you know, big challenges. So ultimately, Paris was agreed upon, and how is it? What were some of the key ways in which the Paris Agreement resolved some of these challenges and these differences?
Well, good question. Let me mention maybe just 3 of the issues, because I don't want to take up an entire week of your time going through 100 of them, but I'm happy to do that some other time. Okay, so the issue of differentiation was probably the toughest nut to crack. You were there and you probably would agree with that. I think that issue was mostly addressed by a US proposal that in turn derived from an earlier Australian proposal. So there were a lot of parents to this proposal. In the run-up to Copenhagen, Australia had proposed that we take a page out of the WTO book and we approach the negotiations in terms of national schedules, and that every country would put together its own schedule, i.e. what it could agree on, to do. And it didn't go anywhere in that Copenhagen context, you know, per se. It was not called schedules. You could look at the Copenhagen Accord / Cancun Agreement and say, well, it kind of was accepted because it did take a nationally determined approach, just wasn't called that. In any event, we thought that a nationally determined approach to emission commitments was the way to go, because it was a way to sidestep the issue of categories. If every country can come up with its own emissions commitment based on its own national circumstances, you don't really need the concept of category A, category B, category C, because the agreement is not telling you what you have to do. And I don't think any other approach really would have worked, you know, based on what I said before. They were just like, if you had to come up with a category approach, I don't think we could have reached agreement on it. So that's largely how that issue was addressed, at least in terms of mitigation. In terms of other issues, and maybe this is part of how the differentiation issue was resolved, is the Paris Agreement is internally differentiated issue by issue in terms of how it deals with differentiation, if that's not too convoluted a way of putting it. So in terms of mitigation, it's this continuum approach of everybody does what they decide they can do. Adaptation is pretty much by definition a continuum, because every country's, you know, geographical circumstances are going to be different in terms of adaptation. And then when it comes to finance, you actually do keep categories. So it's the developed countries that retain the obligation from the UNFCCC to provide funding for developing countries. So you can't really answer the question about differentiation and the Paris Agreement in one sentence. You actually have to kind of poke through it and see how each section handles it. On the issue of the legal nature of commitments, it's a hybrid approach. So it's the Goldilocks between the Kyoto Protocol, very binding, and the Copenhagen Cancun approach of not binding at all. And that solution we owe to New Zealand, which early on realized that you basically had to find a middle ground between those two extremes, and they put one on the table. And I've always thought that their submission was really a model. I show it to my class on that I teach on climate negotiations as you know, a really inspired piece of work. They got it out fairly early in the process, and it kind of seeded the idea, got it into the bloodstream, as we used to say, for a potential outcome. They wrote it in a way that it was geared not really as a national position, but more like, we think this is what would work for the world, including the two, what I think of as the two 800-pound gorillas, which were the US and China. I think they calculated that this would actually be acceptable for both of them. And they also brilliantly explained their proposal in a very upbeat, pro-ambition way, which I thought was also very clever. And I also tell my students it's a good device to use. You know, you could write up that proposal in a way that says, like, we don't think nationally determined contributions should be legally binding, and everybody might look at that and say, ugh, what a downer. But they wrote it in the opposite way. They said, we really think that the following procedural aspects of NDCs should be binding, right? But we don't think that whether you meet your NDC should be binding, because if you did that, it would be really unwieldy. Everybody would have to ratify, you know, each other's emissions targets. It would be very difficult to update them. It would take forever. And what we really want is a very streamlined, you know, easy approach to updating and increasing ambition. And that would be better served by this other approach. So I thought that was very clever. That's a side note. My third issue is, I think one of the other issues going into Paris was where should the agreement sit on the continuum between, at the one end of the spectrum, a very top-down approach like the Kyoto Protocol, like a highly regulatory agreement that tells you everything you have to do and doesn't leave you much discretion at the national level, and the kind of Copenhagen Cancun model, which is very bottom up, leaving lots of flexibility to parties. I think Paris comes out, you know, definitely closer to the nationally determined bottom up end of the spectrum, but with a bunch of international disciplines imposed. So you don't end up with what some said, that the Copenhagen Cancun approach was the Wild West. Everybody did exactly what they wanted to do. There were no rules. You didn't even have to be clear about what you were committing to. It took about a year of workshops to even kind of elucidate what various countries' commitments were they including sinks or not? You know, some very basic things like that. So I think parties were quite intent post Copenhagen to be, you know, to have many more sort of top-down elements sprinkled on top of nationally determined contributions. And as a result, the Paris Agreement, you know, has lots of rules, guidelines, et cetera, that kind of put some boundaries around national flexibility. So I'll stop there.
All right. Yeah, I think you've really given us a taste of, for those who don't appreciate just how difficult a negotiation process it was, how we went from something like the Kyoto Agreement to something as flexible as Paris, and all the different interests that were at play. And we're talking about, you know, very large number of states negotiating. So I'm going to now turn over to my colleague, Patricia, for the next question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sue. These are really unique insights that you can only have from somebody who's been in the negotiations. And, you know, every agreement has its own history, I suppose, depending on who's there and the timing. And it's very interesting to see how, you know, clever engineered solutions that maybe are not the most orthodox ones ended up by coming into being. So now we're a bit over 5 years since the Paris Agreement was concluded. And I wanted to ask you, looking back, how successful do you think the agreement been? And also, there were at least two things that happened in the meantime that were certainly not expected in 2015, which was the Trump's withdrawal from the agreement and COVID-19. So I wanted also to ask you how resilient you think that the agreement has been in face of this circumstances.
That's a very, very fair question. I think if I could talk about resilience first, I think it was pretty resilient in the face of the Trump withdrawal announcement. after the initial kind of shock, no other country followed suit. No other country withdrew from the Paris Agreement. Now, in part, I think that you can't really attribute that to the design of the Paris Agreement. I think part of it may have been purely political. Many countries just did not want to look bad or take the heat, so to speak, for withdrawing from Paris, no matter what the design of the Paris Agreement was. But I think in part it was a result, and maybe this is my own theory and it could be completely wrong, but I think it may have been in part a result of the nationally determined approach. And I say that because, you know, if you look at the Kyoto Protocol, countries negotiated their targets in light of what other countries were agreeing to do. So for example, you know, we took on a more stringent target. I mean, we didn't join, but in the negotiating process, we took on a more stringent target than we otherwise would have taken on. And we pushed other countries to take on more stringent targets in order to kind of match what we were doing. Then we didn't join. So we put them in a very difficult position where they had joined in contemplation of our doing something, and then we didn't do it. And for example, Canada withdrew from the agreement pretty much as a result of that. But the design of Paris, because it was nationally determined, countries were picking targets or commitments that they came up with themselves and thought they could deliver on, quite apart from what anyone else was doing. So I think that really helped. So when the US said, we're not going to join, or we're going to withdraw, countries had less of an incentive to pull out because the things they had agreed to were the things they were prepared to do kind of in any event. In terms of whether the agreement's been successful, I think in some ways, yes, and in some ways it's too early to tell. So on the things that I think the answer is yes, I would say it's definitely been successful in terms of publicizing the climate issue. Everyone has heard of the Paris Agreement. I mean, as someone who worked on every agreement starting in the UN Framework Convention, I sort of, you know, just from my own personal polling, I would say no one had any idea what that was. No one had any idea what Kyoto was until the US decided not to join, and everyone has heard of Paris. The second thing is its goals are everywhere. So, you know, you see well below 2 degrees and 1.5 being taken on board all over the place by companies, by investors, by subnational governments, other international processes like ICAO, IMO, other ones. They are gearing their work towards, you know, contributing to the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And I think, you know, I now see the word Paris aligned or Paris compatible all over the place, and it's just you know, it's assumed that people know what that means, Paris aligned. So I think it's definitely having a very strong influence. But whether it will actually succeed in limiting temperature rise to well below 2/1.5, I think depends on whether parties enhance their commitments and whether they actually implement them. So far, I mean, we're in better shape than we were a year ago, but the latest analysis, I guess, I mean, I'm sure there's several analyses out there. If you look at Climate Action Tracker in particular, they say we're headed at the moment, if everyone did what they said that they were committed to, at this point, we'd be headed for 2.4 degree temperature rise, and that's obviously not enough. So that's, you know, that's what much of COP26 has to be about, like working in these months between now and then to try to get that number lower.
Yeah, we'll revert back to COP26 in a minute. I just wanted to add also, Tom, to something that you said in terms of you know, how the successful the agreement was and how early it is to make a full assessment. But certainly, I mean, also from a more general international relations and international law point of view, for me, it strikes me very much that the Paris Agreement has been the last big agreement that the international community has been able to do in the multilateral framework. So since the last 5 years or so, there hasn't been another major step in terms of multilateral diplomacy in any area. So I think that's also very significant from that point of view. There seems to be that was that window of opportunity that was seized, and indeed the Paris Agreement was, and I think in the history of humankind, the agreement that had most signatures in one single day. So that's also from that point of view quite significant. But I turn now to Nilofer for the next question.
Thank you, Patricia. Yeah, Paris is probably the most well-known agreement, and it certainly has been very widespread. But of course, after all the efforts that went in, and I know the U.S. delegation worked very hard, and there was the election of former President Trump, who withdrew from the Paris Agreement, and the U.S. was such an important part of the whole negotiation, withdrew. But now President Biden was elected, and it's a completely different world for the climate perspective. So with President Biden, his administration, and you're working very closely, of course, so what are the U.S. international climate objectives under the current Biden administration?
There are a lot of them. During the campaign, the international climate objectives there were probably over 20 of them. So, but let me package them for you so they're easier to absorb. I'm going to package them into three sort of general categories. One is getting these are sort of my categories. These are not official categories. Getting the U.S. on track, exercising leadership, and raising global climate ambition, right? So the first one, getting the U.S. on track. I mean, part of what the new administration had to do was basically make up for lost time. And that had a couple components. Obviously, the first priority was to rejoin Paris, and the president signed the instrument on day one. I actually drove the instrument up to New York. Fun fact: we didn't have any of the mechanisms in place to do what one normally does when one joins an agreement. Luckily, the UN was taking electronic instruments at the time because of COVID, so we were actually able to have it count from day one, but we had to deliver it pretty quickly thereafter. Anyway, so another aspect of getting back on track was getting the US NDC ready, right? If you're party to Paris, you have to put in a nationally determined contribution. So a very early executive order from President Biden said, kind of instructed the teams to prepare the nationally determined contribution for 2030, which was already submitted to under the Paris Agreement a couple weeks ago. The early EO also said, come up with a climate finance plan. That's another area where the Trump administration kind of walked backwards from where the Obama administration had been, didn't give the remaining pledge to the Green Climate Fund, among other things. And that plan is already out. And the last part of this getting the US on track that I'll mention is the same executive order directed the State Department to prepare the package that would go to the Senate to get approval to join the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. And that is now done and sitting at the White House. The US already has, it kind of interestingly, normally our process is first you get the Senate's approval to join something that needs to go to the Senate, and then you figure out whether you need implementing legislation, and then you go to Congress to get that. In this case, Congress passed legislation at the end of last year, quite independent of joining the Kigali Amendment, but it's identical to the requirements of the Kigali Amendment. So the US is going to be able to sort of deliver on HFC phase down, whether or not we formally join Kigali. But anyway, that was another piece of getting the US on track. The second piece is leadership. And there you have the appointment of John Kerry as a special presidential envoy. We've not had an envoy at that higher level before. And then carrying out the summit at the leader level that Biden promised during the campaign, which was a huge undertaking, took place on Earth Day and the day after. And the other part of leadership was that the executive order basically directed agencies to raise climate change bilaterally, and in a wide range of multilateral fora. And just to name a few, the G7, the G20, the International Maritime Organization, International Civil Aviation Organization, the Arctic, including the Arctic Council, ocean-related fora, et cetera, et cetera. So I think of these as not just like conventional climate fora, but also, you know, climate plus X, climate plus fill in the blank fora. So in order to show that there are climate implications and considerations, you know, across a wide range of fields. And then third, in terms of raising ambition, I would say, you know, we left Paris with this goal or aim of keeping temperature rise well below 2, pursuing efforts to 1.5. Post 2015, it's become clearer and clearer, including because of the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, that we really need to be leaning into 1.5 much more than 2 or well below 2. So the overarching goal of the administration for COP26 is to, I would put it as like make substantial progress toward keeping 1.5 within reach. We're not going to probably, you know, achieve commitments that add up to 1.5 in the next couple months, but you at least don't want it sliding off the table as a result of what you add up by COP26. Now, like, how do you show substantial progress? You can, it takes many forms. It doesn't just take one form. So you have a collection of countries committing to net zero emissions by, you know, various dates around mid-century. Mostly mostly 2050. Some have said 2060, like China. So, you know, net zero commitments are good in the long term. NDCs are important in the shorter term, in the 2030 timeframe. You know, it's important to focus, like, not just on 2050, but on 2030 for a couple reasons. I mean, NDCs are the currency of the Paris Agreement. So, you know, if nobody updated their NDCs, that wouldn't be so great for the credibility of the agreement. But it's also important to be taking action in the 2020s. And not just, I mean, it's probably politically easier for many countries to just say, oh, net zero by, you know, a date that's 20 years away, 30 years away. You know, it's more meaningful to commit to action within the next 10 years. So we're using our, you know, bilateral and multilateral diplomacy to try to, you know, advance enhanced ambition within the next several months, like on the road to the COP.
And if I may, I mean, one of the examples of what you're just saying about using bilateral and multilateral diplomacy to enhance the goals was the Biden's Leaders Summit on Climate that was recently held. Could you share with us a bit about what you think it accomplished?
Yeah, sure. I think if you take the 3 overarching objectives of US climate diplomacy that I just mentioned, I think it promoted each one of those. So in terms of like getting the US on track, we used the summit as the opportunity to announce our NDC, to announce our climate finance plan, and to announce a whole bunch of other commitments, just like from just a US perspective, to kind of show like, we're back. We're not just asking other countries to do stuff, you know, we're doing stuff ourselves. And also to show the whole of government approach that the Biden administration is taking, you know, by engaging a lot of cabinet officials to lead the different sessions of the climate summit. I think we showed that this is not just, it's not the olden days when just a couple parts of the US government were climate oriented. You know, everyone now is, no matter what subject they work on. And then in terms of US leadership, I think it was a powerful message to the rest of the world that, you know, that the president undertook a summit within the first 100 days and did it at the leader level, made pretty clear that, you know, this is a top priority for this administration. The summit took on lots of different issues. It was mostly focused on the major economies, because it was also a reconvening of the Major Economies Forum, which is basically the 17 countries, including the EU, that account for about 80% of global emissions. So the session that focused on the major economies was obviously mostly focused on increasing mitigation action, since that's, that's what they're important for. But there were also sessions on finance, undertaking climate action at all levels of government. So you had representatives of cities and states and tribes and et cetera from the US and different countries. There was a session on adaptation and resilience, nature-based solutions, and then also climate and security, which is becoming more of a topic. The UK hosted a leader level event when it had the presidency of the UN Security Council recently, and you now see that issue popping up a lot more. In terms of participation, you not only had the major economies, but you had probably 40 or more heads of state participate. That was probably the largest head of state meeting on climate, at least virtually, in a long time. And you also had Secretary Kerry conducted really interesting set of, I think he called them listening sessions, where we got together with about 63 or so ministers from different countries just to talk about like what are they doing on climate change. And it actually struck me how much more interesting that was than a normal COP session. Don't quote me on that, but often you sit at the COP sessions and you're debating, whether to break for lunch or not, or whether the session should meet at night or wait till tomorrow. And this was about what countries are actually doing, and I found it really, really interesting. And in terms of raising ambition, which is the third pillar, I think the summit accomplished quite a bit. It generated momentum, just generally speaking, towards the COP. That was a comment that many, many people made. And the fact that it was live streamed, which is also pretty unusual for a leader level summit to be watched on TV or on a computer, helped generate more momentum. And then specifically, a lot of commitments came in or announcements from various countries. Japan and Canada announced specific new NDC targets. Korea announced that it would terminate public overseas coal finance and that it would put in an enhanced NDC in the next several months. China made an announcement that was probably not as forthcoming as we would have liked, but had some positive indicators in there regarding coal. Russia participated at the head of state level and talked about the need for methane emission control and the need for international cooperation on that. So there was some pretty positive statements out of Russia. And I think the bottom line is that if you add it all up, what the commitments before and during the summit, countries accounting for about 1/2, maybe a little more, of the world economy have now committed to reductions that are in line with keeping 1.5 alive. So I probably buried the lead, but maybe if you remember one thing and one thing only, that's probably what it would be.
Yeah, and talking about the COP in Glasgow in November, that it's will come up very soon, and it will be a nice follow-up for keeping up the agenda. What are your goals for the COP?
Well, as I said, we're very focused on sort of keeping 1.5. There are many different ways to put it. Keeping it alive, keeping it not foreclosed, keeping it within sight, within reach. You could put it in many different ways. We're still thinking about, and I'm sure others are also, how do you tie a ribbon around all these announcements that are being made in the run up to the COP so that you actually have something sort of tangible to point to, like what's the headline the next day? One of the problems I've identified, well, this is before I came back to government, but I wrote an article called something like "Wither the COP," with the H in brackets, meaning, now that there are not that many negotiations left, what is the role of the COP? And in that paper, I sort of pointed out that the COP is, because of its timing at the end of the year, it often is struggling to figure out, how does it keep momentum alive when many things have already been announced way before during the year, right? So you have like the G7, the G20, you have various unilateral, bilateral announcements, you have the September meeting of the UNGA and Climate Week, right? So by the time you get to the COP, like, what exactly does the COP, if the only thing the COP does is the narrow decisions on, the remaining rule book issues, that doesn't look like enough. It's important, but it's not really momentous in terms of raising ambition. So I think one thing we have to figure out is, like, how do you kind of codify everything that's happened over the last year, or in this case, 2 years, right, since there's been a COP. So that's something we are thinking about. Ideas welcome, of course. The rule book also has to be finished, right? So the Paris Agreement didn't finish everything. I'm sure Nilofer misses those negotiations terribly on the elaboration of the different pieces of the agreement. They can be quite mind-numbing, but there are outstanding issues under so-called Article 6, which is the market mechanisms, the new clean development mechanism, rules to avoid double counting under, when countries engage in offset trading or emissions trading. There are outstanding issues concerning transparency and how parties report on their emissions and report on how they're doing in terms of implementing their nationally determined contributions. Those involve, things that you would think would be technical, like they're basically rows and columns. It's, many, many pages of looking at tables. But, as always, there are political and policy issues embedded in how you fill out those tables. And then there's the issue, one last issue that kind of relates to ambition is this issue of common timeframes. In Paris, there was no agreement that everybody should put in their targets for particular years. So you had kind of a hodgepodge of nationally determined contributions, some for the year 2025, some for the year 2030. An issue now is, well, should we sort of standardize moving forward post 2030 so that everybody puts in targets for 2035, 2040, et cetera? Or do some countries still want to keep open the option of, like, having 10-year targets? So that's an open issue, and one that will presumably be resolved at COP26.
Sue, you've certainly taken us through the rich history, I think, of Paris till now, and now with the Biden administration. And I thought the point you made too, it's true. For so many years, people have been used to these intense, difficult negotiations, the COP meetings. And now, after Paris and then with the rule book, what will happen, but we'll leave that discussion perhaps to another time. I've come now to our last question, at least from Patricia and I. Reflecting back, do you think that the Paris Agreement did strike the right balance, between the hybrid legal approach and what you've explained to get the world to limit warming to well below 2 degrees and, hopefully 1.5 degrees centigrade?
Yes, I do think so. I think of Paris like Churchill used to think about democracy, right? He said it's the worst of all political systems except for all the others. So I tend to think of Paris that way. I mean, you can criticize it in a lot of different ways, but I still think it's better than the other options. One reason is that I think it's easy to go back and look at an agreement and say, oh, I like this agreement, except I think the NDCs should have been legally binding. And if you didn't achieve them, they should be subject to, binding dispute settlement and punitive consequences. But you can't do that because that agreement would have completely, those elements would have completely changed the agreement. You wouldn't have had the same participation, and you probably would not have had the same nationally determined contributions, right? If you knew that you'd be subject to some kind of harsh penalty if you didn't meet your target, you probably would have been more conservative in your level of ambition, or you wouldn't have joined at all. So you can't just go, and I think law students do have a tendency to look at agreements and say, I like this, if only it also had this. But I think it's such a careful balance among elements when you construct an agreement in terms of, stringency, participation, enforcement, that it's really kind of a package deal. To the extent that Paris doesn't end up doing the job, and I think we won't really know for a while, like a lot of these targets are 2030 targets, so it's hard to know like right now whether they're going to be met. But I think to the extent Paris isn't successful, I'm not sure I would blame it on Paris. I don't think it's the design of Paris that that is the cause of insufficient action. It's the insufficient political will on the part of countries that will be responsible for not doing enough. I'm not sure that there's a particular other kind of agreement that would have made things come out differently. So that would be my view. But I would add to that it's important to not think of Paris as the only international agreement or international forum that needs to help contribute to the Paris objectives. But the way I think of it is, I call it like greater metropolitan Paris, right? Paris has a certain role for sure and a certain value added, and it's definitely the primary forum, no question about that. But there are a bunch of reasons why we need to look beyond Paris. I mean, first of all, the goals are incredibly ambitious. It's not like a typical international environmental agreement that can basically be implemented within the four corners of that agreement. This is basically talking about transforming the economies of most of the world. So like huge undertaking. Some of the issues were already directed to other places like ICAO and IMO. So by definition, they're the ones that have to take care of aviation, shipping, in a Paris-aligned manner. Some issues require special expertise. Countries are very focused, or some, on, let's say fossil fuel subsidy reform. That's not really going to take place as a negotiation among 200 parties in the UNFCCC. You just don't have the right, expertise to deal with that. Some actions involve players that are not states, they're not parties to the UNFCCC. And I think of like multilateral development banks. They need to take action related to Paris alignment, but they're not sitting at the UNFCCC as parties to the agreement. And some issues are very cross-cutting, so they require action elsewhere. Ocean-related fora have to take into account climate considerations. The development of the post-2020 framework under the CBD is dealing in kind of directly and indirectly with climate-related issues, as it should be. And in some cases, like the WTO or investment agreements, you may actually have rules there that bump up against the ability of parties to carry out their NDCs and other actions. And so their role, might be to positively contribute to 1.5, but it might also be to, consider whether any of their rules are, negatively affecting the ability to implement Paris. So that's kind of a smattering of reasons, I think, why we as, I guess, lawyers and policy people need to think more broadly than just the Paris Agreement. But I will shut up. I know I've talked way too much.
No, please do. I mean, I think it's been fantastic. And you've given all of us a lot to think about, a lot of information. I think that Patricia is so right to have someone with your insights. Not everyone has that. And Paris it's a really interesting agreement. It went into force before anyone was expected to go in 5 years later. It was record speed. In that sense, you could say it's successful. But I agree with you. It's not just Paris. We have to look outside as well. And it's not an environmental agreement. It is really transforming the economy and how we live. So it's not an easy process as well. Now, before I turn over to the audience, we have a special guest with us as well, someone who you know very well, and also a negotiator from the climate change agreements and the COPs, Professor Christina Voigt. And she's joined us today, and I think she will have a question and a comment to make as well. So Christina, welcome from Oslo. It's great to see you. And I don't have to introduce you, you know each other very well from the climate negotiations. And Christina is also now co-chair of the compliance committee under the Paris Agreement as well. So Christina, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Nilofer. But first of all, I would like to thank you, Sue, for your time and for sharing with us your insights. I mean, not only about how Paris came about, but also what happened since and your expectations. This is really a privilege to be able to listen to you, and thank you so much for being here with us today. Well, I have a question. It's a more of a general question about Paris, because it is from the outset negotiated as an international treaty between states. But as you indicated, its impact has gone, above and beyond it. We see it, as you said, companies are referring to it, cities, subnational governments, but also now free trade agreements, Human Rights Council resolutions. But we also have a lot of court decisions, litigation internationally that in one way or the other refer to Paris. So it has an impact so much more beyond a traditional interstate agreement. So what I was wondering is that what did surprise you of everything that happened in the last 5-6 years? What did surprise you most, or what didn't see you coming when we were all celebrating on that December night in Paris when the agreement was adopted, but really was something that hit you by surprise? And also in that context, do we have any other international agreement that can be compared to Paris in the context of that massive impact on all sorts of actors worldwide?
Thanks, Christina, and great to see you. And, one of the, of all the pain we went through to negotiate Paris, I have to say that the high points were working with my fellow lawyers, including Nilofer and Christina. Those are the memories I hang on to. Surprising things. To be honest, I was surprised that the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement. I thought, and this is more of like a national surprise than an international surprise, having worked on the Kyoto Protocol and then been part of the Bush administration. I mean, I was a career lawyer, so I worked for all different administrations. I really thought we had addressed the issues with the Kyoto Protocol in the Paris Agreement, right? Because the issues were the absence of developing countries, the fact that the target was negotiated and, was not sort of derived nationally, transparency, et cetera, et cetera. I thought we had absolutely followed what had kind of emerged as bipartisan international climate policy, including as reflected in the Senate resolution that was anti the Kyoto Protocol. If you looked at those criteria, we absolutely met them when it came to the Paris Agreement. I thought that if a new administration came into place that was not as, let's say, ambitious about emission reductions in the United States, they would still stick to the Paris Agreement and maybe change the target, which I think legally you can do under the agreement. It's not ideal, obviously, but I think it's an option, and I think the world would have, tolerated it given the alternatives. So I was, I guess, most surprised by that. But then I would say the flip side surprise that came along with that was this explosion of activity in the United States to kind of compensate for the walking away of the federal government. And about maybe one day, literally like 24 hours later, you had the creation of 2 initiatives that are going strong now. And I don't think they would have existed if we had stayed in the agreement. Not to say that it was worth it to pull out, not at all. But, one of the surprises was you had a coalition of every kind of, actor you can imagine below the federal level joining in this "we are still in" coalition that basically said, we don't really care what the federal government is doing. We still support the Paris Agreement and the US target. Right? And they're going strong. I think they've changed their name now that the US is back. I think it's like America is all in. And the other is this coalition of states, 25 states. And you might say, okay, well, so what? But those 25 states account for, I think, more than half the economy of the United States. They're the 3rd largest economy in the world. So when you think of it that way, they come right after the US as a whole and China. So 25 states accounting for, the 3rd largest economy in the world stuck with Paris and US targets. So that was a really interesting development that's not going to go away. When you ask about I don't think there are other agreements, certainly not environmental agreements, that have the reach that Paris has had. But what I would like to do, and maybe this is a subject for another webinar, I would like to take the positive features, I consider them positive features, maybe others don't, of the Paris Agreement and apply them to future agreements. And one agreement where I think that I would like to see that happen, I don't work on this directly, but is marine pollution or marine plastic pollution. And what I would think is not the right way to go is to go back to the traditional type of international environmental agreement. It's just, it's among states. It has the following 10 provisions. It's got, what I mean, just like business as usual. I think, particularly in that field where you have so many actors that are not governments, right? You've got cities and states and companies and et cetera, involved in the marine plastics issue. Why not take these aspects of Paris that have been very positive, I think, which not literally allowing them to join the agreement. Like we're not trying to just break the mold entirely, but why not have a chapter that non-state actors or subnational governments can join? Why not take Paris and to the next level or to the next step in addressing international environmental problems? I don't want Paris to be the anomaly that we put together just because we did to solve those problems. I think we should poke through it, figure out what's been helpful, and figure out how to replicate that. And one of the things that makes Paris resilient to future changes in government, not just in the United States and anywhere else, is that it really changed the facts on the ground. So I think we should be thinking of how do you change the facts on the ground or in the water or whatever, not just how do you put a boring international agreement together. So I don't know if that answers your question, but food for thought.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Christina, for that great question. And I think we would definitely love to have more webinars with you, Sue, and Christina as well, bring you as well. So Patricia, go ahead.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the chats, and with your permission, we would abuse a bit of your time and would go for the questions. Maybe I'll take the first one, and Nilüfer, you could take the second one. So we have a question from Nikita Pies that says, thank you to Ms. Biniaz for the insightful inputs of the Paris Agreement. My question pertains to the fulfillment of the commitments under the Paris Agreement. How do countries draw a balance between fulfilling their commitments under the Paris Agreement in relation to NDCs and their obligations under other international agreements? I think it's something that you touched on, but perhaps you could add a few more lines.
Yeah, I don't know if the questioner is thinking about potential conflicts. I don't really think there are conflicts between Paris obligations and other agreements. The commitments under Paris are the things that are actually binding are largely procedural, right? You have to put in an NDC and you have to update it and you have to report on it and be reviewed on and all that kind of thing, and hopefully implement your target as well. But I don't see that as bumping up against obligations. Maybe the only one might be trade, where you would have to consider if you're going to implement your NDC through some kind of trade measure, you'd have to take into account obligations under investment agreements and trade agreements. But there's nothing in the Paris Agreement that says you must do X and in a way that's by definition inconsistent with trade or investment obligations. So I think they're very compatible. I guess I just also think countries should be using their participation in other international agreements to promote the Paris objectives to the extent that they can and break down the silos. We often talk about there are too many silos where one agreement is not talking to another agreement, but that, you know, and that has to be dealt with largely at the domestic level, right? Where each national government should be figuring out how it can promote Paris objectives in the other agreements that it participates in.
All right, we have time for just, in fact, we're going over time a little bit soon, and we really thank you for staying with us, because I know you have a very busy schedule. But this is a question that I have to say addresses an issue that I'm also very interested in. It's from Minako Tanaka. Thanks for sharing the great insights. How does a global stocktake play out in the future of the Paris Agreement? International society needs to wait and see how countries will work hard at least until 2030, but it is highly likely to fall short of that 2-degree goal. What would be the options for countries when it turns out it is still not enough, even though they submitted their NDCs with their maximum ambitions? But bottom line, how is this global stocktake going to work exactly?
Well, it's a great question. It's kind of untested, and we'll see how it works. The first one is going to be in 2023. And ideally, the way it's supposed to function is the global stocktake is supposed to, look at the kind of latest science, latest information that we have, look at what countries have pledged to and are doing, and then countries are supposed to go back and put in their next set of NDCs after that, right? Because NDCs are supposed to be submitted every 5 years. So I think the language of the Paris Agreement is parties are supposed to be informed by the global stocktake when they develop or design the next set of NDCs. So in a perfect world, you would have a global stocktake that basically says, well, in a perfect world, it wouldn't say we're off track. In a perfect world, it would say we're on track. But assuming in 2023, the global stocktake says we're, much more needs to be done, the way it should work is that countries go back and take that into account when they develop their next set of NDCs and make them more ambitious for the next time period. So, can things go wrong? Yeah, obviously. The global stocktake might, it's still not entirely clear whether the outcome of the global stocktake is one that everybody has to agree on. Might someone block consensus on the outcome of the global stocktake? I suppose. But I think it'll be clear enough from the process of the global stocktake, sort of where the world is at that point. And of course, outside processes can take place as well. You can have parallel shadow global stocktakes as well, where civil society is, doing its own assessment of where the world is. Might countries not take enough action in response to the global stocktake? Of course. So all we can do is hope that we've set up a system that is at least designed to work. I think a system that didn't have this periodic global stocktake and then the next set of NDCs would have been, to my point before, this is the best of all possible systems. If we had not had a global stocktake and not had periodic updating of NDCs, we'd be in much, much worse shape.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. This has been really a very, very insightful, over 1 hour actually with you, Sue. And I think our attendees have learned a great deal, and again, from the special insight that you have, but also, I have to say, I appreciated your comments about thinking a bit outside of the box as well. And I think we really do have to look at Paris agreements and other agreements beyond just the traditional approach. And so I do hope that we can continue the discussion with you and have you join us again. This has been really fantastic. And thank you so much, because I know you're so busy right now, so we really appreciate it. And may I say that when this pandemic allows us all to travel, we really look forward to having you in Singapore at the center. And so I know Patricia would like to say a few final words as well. But thanks to all for joining us, and please join us again for our continuing series. Patricia, go ahead.
No, just a final word also to join Nilufer in thanking you for taking time for your busy schedule to share the insights for from the past and the prospects for the future on this such an important topic. The recording of this talk will be available on CIL website and the Facebook. So I think these insights will be also beneficial for those who are not with us today, but will be able to watch it after. So thank you so much, Sue.
Thank you for having me, and look forward to seeing you in Singapore.
And keep up the great work.